So let's begin by working on the first of these steps. To be effective, we must adopt the mindset of the most effective leaders and managers. This is very important because it enables us to implement all of the other strategies and ideas that I'll share with you in this program. It's also tougher than it sounds. Most sales managers and many business owners were once, or still are, successful salespeople. The mindset that it takes to be a successful salesperson is not the same mindset that is required to be an effective leader. You may have heard the old phrase that, quote, the speed of the leader determines the speed of the pack. Well, this old phrase has some merit to it, but it also has a weakness. It implies that all you have to do is be very successful as a salesperson, and all the other salespeople around you will duplicate your success. One look at most sales forces will tell you that this is not the case. I mean, in most sales teams, there's usually one or two top salespeople who are doing very well, and then many others who are not. If you're an owner or sales manager who wants to increase production amongst your sales team, the solution is not to dedicate more time to your own success as a salesperson. If you're going to do that, then why try to even manage other salespeople at all? No, what needs to happen is that a new mindset needs to be developed, the mindset of a successful leader. To do so requires that we adopt some very important beliefs. These beliefs form the foundation of successful leadership. Now, while there are numerous additional beliefs that create success, I've chosen here to focus on several beliefs that I feel are essential to success in managing salespeople. These seem to be the toughest ones to adopt for many sales managers, and in fact, they wreak the most havoc among sales managers who do not adopt these beliefs. In this CD, I'll go through each of these beliefs and discuss the importance and the impact of each. As I go through these beliefs, ask yourself, what must I do to fully adopt this belief? The first few beliefs you must adopt can be best understood by thinking about the beliefs you would have to build and coach a championship team in a professional sport. Ask yourself, how would I act differently if I were building a team with which I'm expecting to win a championship? Well, amongst other things, one of the first characteristics of the best managers and coaches in the world of professional sports is that they look at each position on their team and they compare the performance of the individual playing that position with the best in the sport rather than with the worst. In other words, they don't look to simply fill the position with somebody who meets the minimum requirements. Instead, they fill each position with someone who is already the best or with somebody who has the potential of becoming the best in the near future. Compare this to the criteria that many business owners and sales managers have for hiring and keeping people. I can't tell you how many people I've met in sales management who are happy if they simply have salespeople, regardless of how well those salespeople are performing. They're happy to just have a warm body to manage. They reason that if the person sells anything, then they're better off than if there were no one in the position. In other words, they're comparing their salespeople's performance with the worst possible scenario, having nobody there in their minds, rather than with the best possible scenario. They don't realize that every position on their sales team taken up by somebody who is just barely getting by actually costs them the opportunity to have somebody else in that position who is going to produce much more. On top of that, most of these sales managers ignore the actual costs in both time and money to employ or contract a salesperson. Each salesperson consumes resources and incurs what most industries have come to call desk costs, which include the costs ranging from office space to house the salesperson, to telephone charges, to postage, to shipping, printing costs, and dozens of other costs that are normally incurred by each salesperson working within an organization. In many companies and many industries, these costs can average $10,000, $30,000, $50,000 a year, or even more. In other words, there's a minimum amount of production that each salesperson needs to achieve, even to turn a profit for the company. Sales management should at least know what the desk costs are and demand that salespeople at least meet that standard. But then again, it seems that when our expectations are set at the minimum, we tend to get people who don't even make the minimum. For instance, most firms I've worked with have many salespeople who aren't even covering the desk costs when I first start working with them. Now, for many of these companies, management isn't even sure what the desk costs are, so they really even haven't set the minimum, but some of them have, and people still don't make the minimum all the time. Management in these firms tells everyone that they're happy if the salespeople simply do their best and try hard. So that's what their people are focused on doing. They're not necessarily focused on producing a certain amount. Unfortunately, They fall short of even the minimum productions required to make it worthwhile to keep them. How many salespeople in your company are consistently selling enough to be considered an outstanding salesperson? So the first belief you must adopt is that each position in your sales team is worth much more than the minimum amount needed to cover costs. You must set a minimum standard that is based on the opportunity, not the necessity. For instance, if your desk cost for each position on your team is $40,000 per year, you must decide that the desk must also bring in a certain amount of profit. The desk cost plus the profit you expect should be the minimum standard you set. So decide today what each of your sales positions is worth and then set that number as the minimum standard you'll accept. Again, the manager of a professional baseball team is looking at each position and thinking about who he could have in that position. Everyone else is compared to that ideal. You need to maintain the same type of high standards for each position in your company. Once managers and coaches in professional sports have established their desires, they also tend to be very open about the requirements and standards that are expected. They let their athletes know that there are certain expectations. They challenge their athletes, and their athletes rise to the occasion. The same can be said for the best leaders in any business. People like to be challenged. They like to rise to high standards. Challenge your people, and you'll find that most of them will rise to the occasion. Those that don't will usually earn much more than if your standard was to simply cover the basic costs. And those who don't even come close to your standards should find other work. So the second belief you need to adopt is that people love to be challenged, and your job is to challenge them. Your job is to communicate the expectations and challenge people to rise to those expectations. Again, make sure that your expectations are not set at the minimum, but rather that you're challenging them to a high level. Too often, we do our best to make things easy for people. People aren't doing well, and we don't speak up because we don't want to rub salt in the wound, so to speak. Well, it usually backfires on us. It's much better to set high expectations, challenge people, and then communicate constantly where people are. Now, as a way to facilitate the growth of their athletes, professional coaches also demand that their athletes practice and work to become better at each of their skills. The same is true of great leaders in business. They expect training, they expect education, they expect work on the basic skills and even some of the more complex skills necessary to do well in the business. They demand that their sales force be the most highly trained and well prepared in their industry. You must adopt the belief that constant training and review of basic success principles is essential to your success. Coach John Wooden, coach of the UCLA basketball program for many years and perhaps the greatest coach in the history of the sport. After all, his teams won more NCAA championships than any other program, including 7 in a row at one point, had a simple philosophy about training and about his ability to work on different skills that helped him be as successful as he was. He felt that as a coach or manager, he had within his control the preparation necessary to develop confidence, pride, and skill. He also felt that he could influence but not completely control the level of effort his players gave. What he felt he had very little ability to directly affect were the accomplishments, the actual results. He wasn't playing in the games after all, so he couldn't actually affect the score himself. Because of this, he decided that his teams would be the most well-prepared teams in the history of the sport. In other words, the area that he could affect, the training, the preparation, he figured that that's the area that he would focus on. He had them practice and drill the basics of the game over and over again, constantly pushing them to give more effort and raise the level of their play. He never spoke about winning and losing. He never spoke about the opponents. In fact, he rarely, if ever, scouted another team. He simply asked his players to give all of their effort to practicing and preparing in order to be the best basketball players they could possibly be. The result was tremendous pride, tremendous confidence amongst his players, and tremendous accomplishments. You as a sales manager have within your control the same elements. You can motivate and move people to act well at times, but you really can't affect the exact results that they're each going to get. But the area that you do have a lot of control over is the training. You have a lot of control over the practice and the work on the skills. Make sure that you have the most well-prepared team in your area. What would that do for you after all? Ask yourself, what would happen if I had the most well-prepared, the most highly trained and skilled team of professionals in my industry, in my area, in whatever category you want to place yourself in? If you were the most highly trained and highly skilled team of people, what would that do for your sales team, for the amount of sales revenues that you develop? Establish a culture of training and education within your company. Demand that your people practice, both internally by attending training meetings you hold, as well as externally by taking action out in the marketplace. If you do this, you'll attract the cream of the crop to your firm, and you'll create an outstanding atmosphere. But of course, to carry this out, you must believe that training and continuing education are important. Unfortunately, I've met a lot of sales managers that don't believe that training and education is important. I've met managers who actually brag about the fact that they don't do anything for training. They tell me their war stories about how when they got in the business, they were simply thrown out on the streets and told to do it, and they made it after all. And that's the way that they handle things now. They bring people in, teach them a little bit about the product for an hour or two, and then throw them out there to sell, and they see what sticks. If they sink or swim, that's fine. They'll keep the ones that swim. I've actually had people brag about that to me. Now, it may be true that they survived in an atmosphere where there was no training. It is, after all, true that many salespeople survive in that atmosphere. I don't know about thrive. Some of them do manage to thrive eventually. Others don't. But there are many people who get past that. But as sales managers, our job isn't to perpetuate the problems. Our job isn't to perpetuate the bad conditions that we lived with. Just because we lived with it doesn't mean we have to pass it on. It's almost a twisted thought process when that starts to happen. It's almost like someone saying, well, my parents abused me, so I'm going to abuse my kids. Well, we all know that to be ridiculous. And yet that's the kind of attitude that some of the sales managers I've met have. That needs to change. Adopt the attitude that you are going to have the most highly skilled and highly trained group of people. Part of that will be recruiting, certainly, and we're going to talk about recruiting, but part of it will be the internal training, and we'll show you exactly how to set that up so it's easy to run, doesn't take much of your time, and you're able to get all of the skills developed. But you've got to believe that there's an importance in it. You've got to believe that internal preparation creates external success.